This tutorial will guide you through the process of creating a series of distinct landscapes, primarily marshland, which is situated in Skegness, and it's from my project and master's degree. This process summarizes 9 hours of modeling, setting up views, and post-production. I will speed through some of the sections of the video where the process is repeated, but feel free to reduce the speed in YouTube settings if you want to follow along. To create this render, all of the landscaping, trees, materials, and assets are available in Lumion, so there is no need to download anything extra. Lumion is free for students but requires a membership for other users, which are available on their website. This video is not sponsored by Lumion. These are simply the methods that I use to create the work for my master's degree. An important note is that I am using Lumion 2024, but most of the processes I show here are also available in previous versions. First, check your computer specs as there is a benchmark for the minimum specs required. I decided to start with a template to provide me with some pre-existing landscaping elements I can later use. I'm using Rhino to build the base model as reference, and using the live sync within Lumion I can send my model directly to my project. Once I bring in the model, I reposition it and add clipping planes to contain my sectional model within. I make sure to set the model at 0 on the y-axis, so when I set the sea level, it is accurate to the calculations I have done previously regarding the tide levels. Next, I begin to flatten out the landscape and mountains, as my project is based in Fenlands, which is pretty flat. After flattening the landscape in the far distance, I begin to build on the landscape in my immediate site to match the levels of the topography base I brought from Rhino. You do have the option of modeling your landscape in another software, like Blender or even Rhino, then assigning the landscape material in Lumion. However, in this scenario, I've chosen to model the landscape directly in Lumion, just for ease of use. Using the same landscape tools, I reduce the brush size so I can carve out the rivers. Once I'm done with that process, I move on to add the water mass, which allows me to customize and differentiate it from the seawater. One of my favorite tools within Lumion is the landscape painting, allowing you to combine and blend 4 material types, resulting in a landscape that has depth, realism once rendered. You also have the option to turn on the rocks for added textural effect. The final steps of landscape forming involve carving out the edges and cleaning up any material overspill. It's important to organize your layers, which helps with filtered selection. Next, we move on to adding the plants. There are several ways to add objects like plants in your project. The first method I demonstrate here is the single placement tool. We can use the randomize tool and the place on landscape tool to make the plants appear more organic and natural. Another way is cluster placement, and the third method is using a line, which I will demonstrate later in the project. You can change the tone of the planting to suit the time of year or even the style that you want, whether it's more green, like in the summertime, or more mustard-like in autumn. Moving on, I begin to add in habitation like barns, houses, people, trucks, and so on. As I've mentioned before, a really useful way to add object is distributing it along a line. As you can see here, I've used it to create a fence, which essentially arrays an object along the line until you have no gaps in between. You can adjust the rotation and the randomization of those distributions. As we reach the final stages of setting up the model in Lumion, I move on to create the view. Instead of creating an isometric view, I decided to go for a perspective view and increase the focal length and move further away. This gives me an axonometric feel without being too flat. I also ended up adding one of the template effects that Lumion offers to achieve the light and the tone results as shown. After rendering the image, you can see it looks a little bit plasticky and not entirely realistic. I found you get better results rendering when you are closer to the object in question. However, in this situation, I couldn't avoid this because I wanted to capture all of the model in one view. To get better results, I opted to use Krea AI, which essentially upscales your image and adds more realistic textures and finishes to what is already there. Krea is free to use for producing 2K resolution, but I ended up paying around £8 a month at the time to upgrade to 4K and 8K quality. Do check their website for the latest subscription fee. As you can see, it did a great job with adding realistic lighting and reflections on the water and the grass. However, there are still some areas I would like to improve further. So to move on, I use Photoshop 2024 with the Generative AI capabilities or Photoshop Beta. From this point on, I start generating some areas to clean up the model, remove the background and add extra detail to make the section visually balanced. Just a disclaimer, this isn't necessarily a Photoshop tutorial. There are other channels that give you a step-by-step. It is more to show you how Photoshop can play a part in producing your architectural visualization. The only extra landscape detail I wanted to add is an underwater sectional view to show the reflection of the water and seabed, with fish swimming below sea level, and this I think adds a little bit more realism to the section. Finally, we're here, a completed rendered section, 9 hours later, all summarized under 9 minutes. You may question, should I spend all the hours creating model? But I really think that once you do have an actual model, you can dissect it, extract specific details from it, and as you can see in this scenario, I've created a drought condition by simply changing the sea level and turning off most of the vegetation, and also changing the material of the landscaping. That process in itself is quite quick, because everything is already set up. Whereas if you have to create the same view in drought condition using AI, it might not keep the same perspective, it could change certain elements that you want to keep the same, so you have a little bit more control by creating an actual model. I hope you found this video useful. Do leave a comment if you have any questions or specific requests you'd like me to review in my next video.